Record audio. I think that should. I think the audio should get recorded. It says
Yeah.
it says 2 or more callers. So let's. Okay, so the topic for today was single page app versus traditional. So what I thought that what I could talk about actually, since the idea was basically adapting to single page app development for developers who are basically coming from from a background with traditional web application development. So that's the topic. Again, so I mean, what I have is basically like just some of the things that I found that are good to kind of put some thought into before you kind of dive into single page app development. We won't be talking in detail about any frameworks or anything like that, just a few pointers, just a few other things here and there. Also, feel free to kind of just jump in at any given point if you have any questions, if you have any alternate experience, I mean, anything to share from your experience. So that's perfectly fine. So really quick about me. So I've been working on web applications since 2004, which is a really, really long time. I've been at Solution Street since 2012. For the last year or so, basically, been working on an Angular app. So, which I think I was talking to somebody here. Basically, that was the first time I actually worked, hands-on on on a single page app. And I've also visited the Grand Canyon 3 times. Just been to the bottom once, but yeah. So anyway, so how did we get here, right? So I mean, most applications, I guess, when we talk about web applications, when they started becoming like kind of dynamic and so on, what used to, I mean, they were all kind of server-side frameworks, right? So what we used to do is you send a request to the server processes the request, it puts the page together and sends you a whole new HTML page for every request, right? So I think that's what when we say that's what I think what we were kind of referring to in our topic as traditional web application development. Uh, Initially, like I mean, it was the Wild West, right? PHP, JSP, ASP pages. I mean, SQL. I've seen stuff like SQL in the ASP code and so on. And then MVC became popular, which kind of gave some structure to the way we do web application development. The Struts was, I think, the first framework that I used, which kind of uh, allowed me to, okay, so now you can use something that is better than servlets to actually do web application development. But Struts was, I mean, it came with its own baggage. It was very verbose. Next thing that everybody did was, okay, everybody learns Ruby on Rails. That's basically what, that Ruby on Rails became popular, I thought, because it was like something that, it focused on developer productivity. Everybody who learned Ruby on Rails seemed to really enjoy it. So that became very popular next. So I think over time now, I think we've kind of settled into this, few frameworks that have become very popular. I mean, these are just a few examples. I think the big four, if I may, I mean, I have Django in there because I mean I'm working on a Django app, so I just have that. I mean, it may not be as popular, maybe as some of the others. But that's what we have. Uh, but so far, I mean, we haven't talked anything about JavaScript, right? Because I mean, when we do traditional web application development, I mean, initially when like at least when I started, like we used to almost like frown upon JavaScript. Right? It's something that you add to like okay, you something that you add to make the application work a little better, but never depend on it because you cannot depend on JavaScript because the browsers may throw it out, the users may have it like disabled or whatever. So whatever you do, and also like JavaScript was hard, right? I mean, it there was different browsers behave differently and so on. So this was the attitude that most of us took with Java. I mean, at least what I took to Java. So, I mean, I think after that, I think what I remember as being the game changers in the way we looked at what was possible with web applications, right, was Google Maps. I think this was released maybe 2004, I mean, in that time frame. But the biggest eye opener, I think, was Ajax, right, which was I think 2005, around I think Java 1. I think that there was a talk which kind of just went viral at the time, which was emails. Nothing much more than that. But that kind of brought everybody's attention. I mean, and that was kind of surprising to a lot of people at the time because everybody thought that okay, XML HTTP request, which was the basis of Ajax, that's been around since 1999 or 2000. I think ironically Microsoft invented that, but it became really popular in 2005. So anyway, so that's what happened. But even after that, what happened was I think a lot of the tools that I saw that came up with, I think mostly try to shield the developers from JavaScript. Google Web Toolkit was one of the biggest things that I think was that started, which was like write everything in Java, we'll generate the JavaScript for you. I have Infostatistics over here, which I think it was a UI toolkit, but again, that was again like it generated a bunch of JavaScript and just I mean there are like maybe hundreds of these. I mean I think just have that as an example because I think I use Infostatistics. It wasn't fun. So next, I think, so next what came was jQuery, right? So jQuery came, it was the answer to all our problems. It took care of all the cross-browser stuff, and suddenly developers are like, okay, we can write JavaScript. People, like, even people who are doing server-side development are like, okay, we're okay with putting some JavaScript on our application. Then everybody was like, so no, this is the trend. I mean, I was just curious and I was putting this together. So I just looked up the Google trend for JavaScript. As you can see, it has, a straight line going up all the way to sometime 2012, late 2012, and then it kind of levels off, and now it seems to be on its way down. And I mean, not really sure what the reason for that is, but I mean, we could say it's single page apps and some of the new frameworks, but I think as it was pointed out to me, it was jQuery still is the basis for a lot of those things already. So, but I just thought it was interesting. So anyway, single page apps right now. So here's.
It could be better standardization of browsers too. You don't need jQuery.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great point actually. Yeah. I think so. Now the new browsers. I mean, at least the modern browsers have much better support for a bunch of JavaScript, right? So.
I think there's some issues with PS6 comes that there's some issues with jQuery coming eventually. Right. With what they're trying to do in terms of, so there's a movement away from those cases because generates HTML has to become fly, right? Static generates everything as opposed to dynamic. So web components stuff is a bit push against.
All right, so now coming to single page apps. I mean, single page apps, I guess, are web apps that you just load a single HTML page, and then everything after that happens dynamically. It happens asynchronously, in the browser, in the page. You don't. I mean, usually I think after the first page load, there's no full reload happening. There are just sections of the page that are being updated, dynamically, and everything is happening, I think, using JavaScript. Steve Jobs killed Flash, so everything is happening using JavaScript now. So some of the popular single-page app frameworks, as you talk about again. I mean, I just have a few examples over here. There are many more. I guess there's probably frameworks. Somebody's writing one right now, probably putting it on GitHub. But I mean, Backbone was I think the first one that became really popular, and angular.js, with Google's backing, is becoming like it's gaining more and more traction. I think Angular 2 is gonna be like Hibernate was to entity frameworks. I think it's gonna be just the implementation that becomes the standard at some point. So anyway, so now that we are in this new world of single page app frameworks, what we have to do is figure out how to adapt, right? So I think now we'll just talk a little bit about that. First step is learn JavaScript, right? I think there's no, I mean, for us now there's no way to get around that. Does anybody know who this is? Crockford. Okay, there you go. That's an official portrait, right? It looks pretty good. All right, so I guess you get one more. Come see me after. And that's it. We're done. Right? You learn JavaScript, and we can all go home. But I guess since we have to keep talking, maybe we talk about some other things. So I think when I started doing single page app development, I think I went for a workshop run by this guy called Kyle Simpson. I think it was probably a couple of years ago, and I think the way he presented like some of the things that are now getting more and more important, I think that was really useful. I think it kind of lined up with the way that I was thinking of the challenges of single page app development. So I kind of give him a big plug here. And since also I use his material for a lot of my presentations, so this is fair. So what exactly did I not know, right? So I think for me it was just the concept of asyncs and callbacks, and then I think later on, as I did, I think for the current project that I'm working on with Angular, I think it was promises. So I think, and it was, I mean, obviously there are many other things that you need to figure out, but this one I thought we might want to. I mean, I probably want to spend some time talking about this couple of things here. So with async is, I think it's the fundamental change in the way we look at our code, right? So with if when you write code on the server side, you have a block of code, everything runs one after the other. You call a method, you get the response, but everything is happening in sequence. But when you look at a large chunk of JavaScript code, there are all these things that are happening. So fundamentally, what's going on is that, like, there's things that are happening immediately, and there are things that are happening later, right? So you have to really, like, train your mind to think about when you look at the code, look at it correctly in that way. It's one of the most common techniques to implement the later sections of the code is the callback, right? So I mean, right now over here we have an example of, I mean, it says arbitrary, but you can pretty much, if you look closely, you can see it's jQuery. You have basically an Ajax function. It calls out to the server, and then you give it a function which is going to get called with the data that the first call returns. Right? So that's basically it. And although, I mean, synchronous calls may be possible, you never want to do that, obviously, in your JavaScript, because as soon as you call something synchronously, even if you're able to do that, it's basically going to just lock up the whole browser. The whole browser will become unresponsive, and there'll be nothing else that the user will be able to do at the time. The other thing that is important, I mean, is kind of useful to keep in mind is async is not parallel, and we'll see what that means in the next slide here. So again, this is the same. I mean, it's a very simple example where there's a bunch of code which runs. Some of it runs now, some of it runs later. So as you can see, the first two lines will just run immediately, and then there are two function definitions, and the next two lines after that are actually Ajax calls to a server with the two functions that are being defined are callbacks to that, right? So, but I think when we talk about async, JavaScript async behavior, what's done, like when the JavaScript is executing, it's always going to run to completion, right? So like if something was, if you imagine something being truly parallel, functions foo and function bar may like run one line at a time, right? So the first line may run and the first line of this next function may run and so on, because the responses came back at the same time. But that's never going to be the case, right? So what's going to happen when something like this executes is that you're going to just call the function. I mean, based on which call return first, it's basically the end result is going to be one of two, right? Either the whole function foo is going to run first, or the whole function bar is going to run. So that's something that would be something that you would keep in mind, right? So in some cases, like over here, when we look at foo and bar, they're kind of acting on the same set of variables, right? So in most cases, you wouldn't want to leave it like completely non-deterministic. You would probably want to sequence them, right? You want to do something else to make sure that whatever you want, like either foo has to run first and bar has to run second, so that there is some kind of coordination between the two callbacks, right? In some cases, you don't care, right? For example, in this case, foo or bar may return, and they, since we are kind of, the results that we're getting back from the functions are, basically updating separate parts of, of a dictionary. We don't really care which function returns first. All we care about is that, making sure that both the functions execute. So in this case, something like this might be acceptable, although where something like this, may not be. So these are a couple of quotes about callbacks, which again, as I said, really resonated with me because it like, it kind of tried to explain, whenever I was trying to kind of explain like the difficulties that I'm having with callbacks. I think this kind of captured that. It's because when you look at code, right, when you look at the code that you're reading, you think of it in step-by-step terms, but you have to fundamentally like kind of train your mind to not do that anymore, right? So you have to basically make sure that, whenever you see a callback, you have to make sure you kind of, understand that, this might be actually executing later. So there's any code that lies after that, may not, may actually execute before what's in the callback function.
You do have similar behavior with things like lambda.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, this is there, and I mean, many programming languages will have certain, these behavior, but I think they're not maybe as widely used, right? I mean, yeah. I mean, I think in this case, I mean, it's kind of a fundamental building block, right? Because I mean, you can get away with not writing any lambdas. You can write a function instead. But in this case, I mean, you can't really. I mean, I mean, JavaScript callbacks, and I mean, you have to use them because otherwise you won't be able to write anything that will, do much of any use, right, on the front, especially in single-page apps.
And nobody knows Haskell.
Yeah, I don't know that either. So the other code, I mean, the other code is interesting because, I mean, I was reading up again, I think just before, as preparations of this, I read a couple of articles where like, this code says that, the answer to this is we're not multitaskers. But I read a different article that said, yeah, we are multitaskers, humans can do many things at the same time. So I think even like the literature on, even the examples people use to explain the same thing sometimes come up with different answers. So the next thing I think is like, when you see code like this, you can see that, of course, nesting of and chaining of callbacks basically, allows you to kind of make sure you sequence operations correctly. This is just some pseudocode to kind of just explain, the something, many operations that that can happen. So assuming that do C and do all, or do A are all asynchronous functions. Does anybody want to take a shot at telling me what the sequence of this would be like?
So for this one, you will do D first.
D.
Then do B, then A. You do AF, then B, C, E, then D.
So you said A, F, B, C,
E, C,
E, and D. Yeah.
Do you get a mug?
Yeah, you get a mug. Yeah. Perfect. So that's true, right? I mean, so I think that's one of the things that, again, like, when you see some code like this, I mean, you have to really, like, break it down into. Is it? I mean, is anybody still working on this? And can I explain this?
I think you should get a mug yourself.
Okay.
Naming your non-function.
I don't know. Again, as I said, I pulled this off Kyle Simpson's book. So
Is it a language requirement to promise modeling? Is it a language requirement that if the function under UC is instantaneous, that it cannot execute prior to E, or is it indeterminate? I'm trying to remember if it's, I know implementation wise to work where you're sitting, where you're drawing it out. I'm trying to remember if that's an implementation issue or if it's a language issue, because a promise technically means it's a separate thread, so it can run. So it is possible.
So this is not even a promise yet, right? This is just a callback.
Well, it's a
But
callback,
I mean,
but
yeah, effectively it would be a
I'm trying to
promise.
remember if you can guarantee it. It's whenever it's ready.
No, but I think what you're saying, I think will probably get illuminated in the next slide. And I think the answer is that it's not required, right? I mean, do see it may be, I think, okay, so again, I think we have a similar example again here. So based on what we saw before, the order would be A, B, C, D, E, F, and it's kind of just cheating the order, right? Because it's just in alphabetical order. But I think goes to what you're saying. What if D and A are not?
There's implementation issues that come into play of how it's done about the firing of the sequence.
Right.
Multi-thread implementation.
No, but again, as you said, callbacks don't have to be asynchronous, right? So if they're synchronous, right, that's going to be the order.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's. Yeah, like the for each loop, like the for each also uses a callback, but those callbacks are, I mean, they're going to run to completion. There's not going to be a suspend, like the execution is not going to suspend and look for the next thing to execute because it's going to just run to completion at that time.
The challenge I found isn't full readiness and like writing stuff and this stuff. It's more testing it. That's where people get in more trouble because they test one scenario and then things don't work the way they expect, especially when you're launching multiple ones. When you launch two different parallel sequences, and they come back in different response times.
Right.
And they don't test the scenario. Well, what if this one came back after this one because this server happens to be a little slower now? So they test it in a dev environment where the databases are small, and they go to prod and the database is big, and suddenly all the test cases start failing, and they don't know why it works in dev.
Right, because the ordering is completely different.
because they're setting some sort of lower variable in the first response,
Yeah.
and the second one takes advantage because
Right.
they haven't decoupled their code from it.
Right. So anyway, so I think but what happens in the end is this, right? I mean, I think this is what showed up when I actually searched for callback hell, because that's the technical term. So this was just this meme that just showed up. New thing that was supposed is not supposed to. So the next thing that I think just kind of going to the what you were saying earlier is promises, right? So promises are now I think going to become the building blocks of one of the biggest building blocks in ES6. So what callbacks give you is an inversion of control, right? So you basically, especially when you're working with external libraries and so on, right? I mean, what you do is like, for example, a credit card, company, right? Something that's gonna charge a credit card for you. So what you're gonna do is pass the credit card number and then a function to call if if the credit card was successful or not, right? So basically, you're handing off control of your function to this external library, right? So what promises allows you to do is to basically take back some of that control, right? So what it's basically inversion of control, which is control maybe, right? So so the spec, the promises A plus spec is probably one of the most readable specs that you can find. It's just one page. I would encourage everybody to go read it. Because I mean, especially if you're going to be working with single page apps, I think it's going to be very important. But for now, as you can see, IE is still at the cutting edge of not supporting anything. Firefox, I think most other browsers, I think Opera Mini, I guess you can give them a pass because nobody probably uses them. But meanwhile, I mean, like the promises are available in the form of libraries, right? So there are a few popular libraries that kind of more or less implement the spec the way it's written, and maybe then some. The Q spec I think was the inspiration or the basis of the Q library within Angular. I think that's what I've used the most. I think there are a few others. jQuery has something similar called deferreds. Deferreds? They're not exactly deferreds. Deferreds? Yeah, deferreds. So they're not exactly compliant, so you have to be careful when you use them. Also, I think as you were saying, I think they might. I think jQuery is probably on a kind of collision course with ES6 of some sort. Is that what you were saying, or can you talk about it? Yeah.
Just that there's a movement now about using jQuery or having dependencies on it. As people are trying to. Well, jQuery's kind of gone their new route, so they cut support and other stuff in the development team. I understand there is still dependencies that things use it, but you're supposed to be limiting its use because of the efficiency that it produces. I don't know how you don't know of any efforts to attempt to put the S6 concepts into jQuery the way they're doing with everything else. Like Angular 2 is trying to build that whole framework that when you have the S6, it'll work this way, and when you don't, it will work this way. I don't know if there's an effort in jQuery to do the same, where I've seen them really made any big changes in the last couple of years, except for Word.
The latest version of jQuery.
What is A++? Okay. So that's Okay, so just about, I mean, just a little bit about promises, right? So I mean, promises basically represent a future value. So I mean, this is just an example to illustrate what promises is. I think most of the time when you use promises, you're never actually constructing the promise explicitly, unless you're writing your own library of some sort. But the promise object that is returned from a function, what you want to do. So when you basically, as you can see in the example over there, the P that is returned from the function foo is actually as a promise. And when you actually act on it in a subsequent function, what you have to do is basically call it with .then, right? And the .then is basically will basically and the function that you give to the .then as a parameter is essentially the callback, right? And I think based on the spec, the first function is to basically use when for something for the success case, and the second function is for the failure, and then you do something similar. I think that's one pattern to use it. Alternatively, I think what's probably more popular, I think this is the way most of us use it, is basically taking the promise and then directly calling .then with the two function callbacks with it. So I think the first part is exactly the same. I think what we've changed here is just just the way the promises are used by the calling function. Right. So what promises allows you to do, I think, a little bit better than just using callbacks straight up is I think you can have a sequence of operations that need to happen one after the other because it's possible to chain promises. So you can just keep calling .then one after the other, and then you can just have a chain of a chain of operations of sequence, a sequence of operations that can happen. And then you're guaranteed to make sure that everything happens in the order that you've specified it.
Is it better or is it just more readable?
I think it's more readable essentially.
You
At
can
least for me.
define an error handling function as well.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're using callbacks, you have to do
Every time. Yeah. I think that's a good point. I think the Q library that I've used with Angular, I think it has a .catch.
Yeah.
I don't think it's part of the spec, but I think most of the libraries allow you to kind of just have a chain of .then, and then in the end you can just have a .catch. And I think that's better than actually having an error handler for each each then, because if there's a problem with with the then function or with the callback function, then that error gets just eaten up.
Yeah, and that assumes you just want to chain them because you want the flow to guarantee the first one completes before the second one,
Right.
as opposed to parallelizing them and having a semaphore where they merge together.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's what chaining is for. So I think what you were talking about is basically just exactly the next example. So I think I mean, I haven't used this explicitly yet, but I think this is again something that will be very useful. Again, going back to the previous example that we see with callbacks, when you don't really care for there's no dependency within the operations, but you want to just make sure that a bunch of things happen, and then you want to do something else. Like a use case for this would be like you have a table, you check off a bunch of things, and then you hit delete, right? You don't really care which ones get deleted first. You can just fire them off. You just want to make sure that all the delete operations come back with a success response before you can report back to the user or update the front end saying that everything's done.
The other value that we've seen is when you're writing kind of an API library, and one of your calls could become async,
Right.
if you pass back a comment, future callers of that method can tag things on, after
Right.
the call is made, or instead of doing its spams, passing callbacks, and pass callbacks around, you just get prompts you can tack on more things.
Right. I think that's one of the things that I read. Like even with callbacks, right? I think if there's I think there are functions that in some cases that may be synchronous or asynchronous based on the case, right? So I think what most library designers would do in this case is that if something can be asynchronous, it's always asynchronous, right? So even if, like in our case, I think we have a case where we cache the values for a drop-down list or something. It usually returns the promise and we cache the value, but in the calling function always gets the promise back. So the library kind of takes care of making sure that either it's going to go to the server or it's going to return the cache value back to the caller, right? So I mean, I think that right. The caller doesn't need to know. I think all they need to know is that they're going to get a promise back that's going to resolve to a list or resolve to whatever. Right?
You still could do that with callback.
Oh, right. Yeah, you can do this with a callback too. I mean, I think that goes regardless of whether it's a promise or a callback. Right. I think we're just talking about general. I think just the philosophy of if something is asynchronous, just make sure it's asynchronous every time. Right. I think the promise is just the next level for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So now again, we said we have promises, all the problems with callbacks go away. But again, I think this was again something that I saw. You can have something like this. Again, there are. So I mean, now that we are here, does anybody want to take a shot at what are the differences between each of these four cases? Pardon? Syntax error? It's not a syntax error. Yeah, I mean, it's a function. I mean, we're assuming.
I'm asking, you're trying to pass, you're trying to.
Yeah, we're passing the function to the last one. Yeah. I think I actually, I mean, so that's a good point, right? So I thought there was something. I thought that the number 4 and number 1 were almost similar, except they're not in one case. Right, right. But also, I think what happens is that for the fourth one, I think the function is going to get the result of do something, right? In the first one, do something is always called with no data. But with the fourth one, I mean, if the function definition accepts parameters, it's going to actually get the result of the parameter.
And the third one actually doesn't really.
Right.
When you run, the moment you execute the line, it's not going to wait until.
Exactly.
the result.
Yeah, because it's just calling it, right? Yeah. So anyway, so I mean, I think we have. So I mean, we can. I think we covered most of the solutions there. So, but if you want to read this article, I think this links to the actual article where this came from. It's basically, I think the title of the article is "We Have a Problem with Promises." It kind of just goes through all the scenarios in which there are rookie mistakes and there are advanced mistakes, and I think that's again something to it's a good thing. Even if you've been working with promises for a long time, it's a good thing to just read up on. Just remind ourselves of things that can go wrong.
Did you find this on JavaScript Weekly? I read that same article and I don't know, I mean, where you originally saw it.
I'm not sure. I think do you remember? That's my wife. She may have sent it to me, or maybe I sent it to her. I don't know.
Is that how you found it?
Yeah. So anyway, used to be called back Helen, I guess. So what else, right? So I think this covers a lot of callbacks and promises. I think before we move to the next part, I mean, does anybody want to just bring up anything that that I didn't talk about or that you might want to share with the group? Okay.
Function program.
Like Scala. Okay. So it's called bacon?
Bacon.
Bacon? Not vegetarian friendly.
Do you like functional programming? Why? It gives you some advantage. Like when I do the flat now, especially when you type something for autocomplete, is that I can type 2 letters. By that time, post the request. We either add one more letter. Now it's very good. But we really don't need the pre-requisite. This one filters the always gives the latest response. Provide some of them.
So performance.
Performance it improves the performance. It's basically eliminating some of the old requests, just starting, and it keeps the user not like coming up with the autocomplete for windows multiple times. And also calculation of like for each. So like when you would want to apply the functions in for each one.
What did you say you were using? You were using that? Oh, so you use bacon to do the filtering the first place.
That is very helpful.
And like in this.
Yeah.
The first to inherit this function.
Okay, so one of the things that I think has really become really sophisticated in recent times. I think this may not be as specific to single page app development. It's maybe just mostly modern app development, like even for regular web page apps. But it's probably very important for single page app development is the whole ecosystem around tooling. So when we talk about tooling, I think we're talking about things about these are the majority building blocks for any application. You have some application structure boilerplate, which is the scaffolding. You usually would use like some external libraries or frameworks, things that things that are available, on GitHub, or things that things like for a file upload or for processing credit cards or something, anything like that. Dependency management, and then you have the build system that's going to take care of a lot of the pre-processing that you have to do for your JavaScript, the test, and then build and the deploy system. So here we have scaffolding is basically like creating the application structure. You have to usually, I think that's one of the something like scaffolding tools help, because whenever you are starting a new framework or starting with something new, it's usually like you're just staring at a blank page and it's really intimidating to start with, right? So I think I mean most Ruby or Rails does it, Django does it. I think there are usually commands that you can run that just generate the application structure and just the empty files for you, which you can then start filling in with your code. So I think similar tools exist for single page app frameworks too. Dependency management is getting more and more important now that everything is getting virtualized. Build systems are moving to virtualized servers. We have a case, I think, for our application that we were building, like we were for every build we kind of build the server from scratch, which includes like loading the dependencies for the server libraries as well as for the JavaScript libraries at build time, which may not be the best idea, but things like that are possible. So tools that help you manage those kind of dependencies are very useful. And then finally you have build systems of task runners. I think these are important in many cases, like to run your tests, to run your tests repeatedly. And the other thing that that help a lot in the build systems, especially for single page apps, is for some things that help you kind of put together your JavaScript, from your development environment to something that can run within the browser. It's because, like, if you're writing a whole application using JavaScript, you're not going to put it in one file. If you are, it must be amazing managing everything. But that's not going to be the case usually, especially in the team where you are sharing. There are many developers. But again, like the JavaScript, putting JavaScript in different files doesn't really mean anything, right? Because if it's going to run in the browser, it's going to be like basically one big concatenated file, or if you want to include each file separately. But it, again, doesn't really it's whatever structure you want to give to your JavaScript sources, it's basically just for your convenience, right? So the build system basically help watch any changes for JavaScript, and they immediately like just pick up the changes, roll them up into something that's actually on your page. So when you refresh your browser, you have the latest sources, any changes that you made, and so on. So one of the things that the prerequisites for most of these tools are Node and NPM. I think Node.js has become like the kind of the epicenter of all these tools, especially the tools that are needed for these front end for single page app development. Scaffolding, again, there's not. I mean, I actually haven't used any of these personally. I mean, I've used Bootstrap, right? Bootstrap is like the thing that saved us. I think I was previous slide I was thinking about it in a way that Bootstrap does CSS for developers, like the same thing that jQuery did for JavaScript, right? I mean, you just you just include Bootstrap in your HTML5 boilerplate was one of the early scaffolds that were available, where you just kind of you generate like a HTML you call it the blank page. Basically it included all the libraries. It basically set everything up for you so you can start working on your app. Yeoman is actually, it looks really interesting. I haven't used it again, but it has generators for most single page app. I mean, most frameworks. I mean, I see. Have you used Yeoman or?
Oh yeah, just a little bit.
Okay.
I was formally used. I thought it was really useful to do the initial layout of a program. Then when it got to it, it's kind of neat because you say yo service and create service for you. But to be honest, I actually thought it was easier just to do it in my editors.
In your editor, yeah.
But I quickly broke the whole Yeoman flow because I was a bad person about it.
What it's really good for is just getting the boilerplate.
Yeah.
Right.
Use it as a learning document.
Right. I think you use it like just the first time, and then once you see what is generated, I think you just you can take it from there, right? I mean, I think
that's what I basically did.
Yeah.
But the problem is I really feel like I should be using it for more, and it doesn't force me to do things like the correct karma cases because it generates templates for you and makes me do that instead of saying, oh, I'll do that later, which I should do.
Yeah. And then said, mean.js is something that is, I think this is the modern stack, right? I think it used to be LAMP and now it's mean, right? I think it stands for Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node, right? Yeah.
Big data.
Yeah. But big data. Yeah.
JS, I like the framework. They have the VJS site. They put all that stuff, Yeoman, HTML,
Right.
of course, Bower, and they also have Grunt and I think Gulp.
Gulp,
I think
right.
is the newer one,
Gulp,
but
yeah.
They have Grunt, everything is integrated in. So it's really nice. You can look at all the code and you can see how they did it.
Right.
And they have a watch set up. So all you have to do is just, save your file and it reloads the web page. It's great. It's like having an IDE.
Right. So I think we just talked about this. Bower is actually really cool for dependency management. I think it's saved a lot of time in terms of trying to figure out. I think this is like become the de facto dependency management for single page apps. I think it's what npm was for Node modules. Bower is for basically for front end. Right. Yeah. Do different things. Yeah.
One's the front, one's the back.
That's probably true. Yeah.
It's not quite there yet.
Right.
It works for me. I mean, I use Preserify them.
Yeah. Same. Yeah. But yeah, so I think this is just an example that I pulled out of our one of the projects that we're working on. As you can see, there are so many dependencies that you have to manage. It lets you express the dependencies in terms of approximate versions, or any version, or like more than version. And in some cases, if you have, if you want explicitly use a certain version of some of the libraries, you can do that too. And in the end, you just run Bower install. It just gets everything from GitHub, and it sets it up for you in your wherever. I think you configure a lib folder, it just puts it there. Then you just have to take from there, include it in your app.
You could just about copy and paste that file and VM install.
Right. Yeah.
Except 9% of the time, when I try like a new project with NPM, there's always something wrong. Like I have to do an apt-get to set up something on a server that's not 100% right because some dependency is not in it needs to be, or my grunt version is not. I don't know what it is with NPM, but every time I've done like Ansible installation or something else like that, it's always NPM that causes me the trouble every time. It's just like, oh well, this I didn't have the firewall set up correctly because NPM counts on the Git to pull it this way, so you have to change the protocol it's using in this case, and then oh wait, you need to have this version of the RVM installed to get the SAS compiler to work correctly, so you have to do this piece to get it. It's not necessarily wrong, and it's just the tools that I'm using to if you are packaging it, they're not.
Yeah, I think I made the mistake of actually running the first time I ran like install Node or something. I ran it as sudo, and then it just messed everything up after that because it sets it up with like the root permissions and then one of the folders, and then now I have to run it with sudo every time. But I tried with my local login, it doesn't work. I just have to run it.
Yeah,
I need to
you
find
get
it
that
out
one
to fix.
where you set up the dev flag,
Right.
the -g flag incorrectly once.
Right. Yeah.
And then everything's kind of wonky.
It's completely wonky.
I'm sure there's a good way to fix it if I want to like figure it out. It's just,
Right.
Sudoing is just remembering it.
Yeah, but it's, but that's the thing with these tools, right? I mean, we spend so much time setting it up, and once they're working, you just run with it.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are, like, as we said, most important, like, to set it up once correctly, and but the kind of, the productivity gains you get, from them, just things running automatically in terms of, like, if you talk about, as you were talking about previously, the builds, like, if you have gulp running to, concatenate the files every time you make a change, so you don't have to worry about doing all those things manually, or even like, I think in some cases, I think there are cases where you might want to.
You can even set up a development environment, like you have a development production.
Right. So you can have different flags, yeah.
Tell you what line, in what file you've got a problem.
Right, because I think what happened was, I think for the current project that we're working on, we are not using Gulp. We're using, like, the Django has something that, like, an asset pipeline tool called Django pipeline, and that it does something similar. And I think what I like about that is that it allows you to keep the files, individual files, in the dev environment, and allows you to kind of concatenate and deploy a single file, or even minify it when you do it on the server. So
you just say grunt production or something like
Right,
It's an
right,
environmental variable.
Yeah, general question, just,
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
for your Bower, modules, are people checking them into SVN and or Git, or are they referring to them, or are they just bypassing and only using that for development and using CDN sites?
So I mean, I think I can start with that because we just had a recent example in problem with this, right? So we were just checking in bower.json and not actually checking in any of the actual, modules that were downloaded from Git. But what we noticed was that occasionally a build on the build server would fail because the dependencies had changed and so on. So what, I think we just switched completely the other way around, where we just kind of we done Bower only in the dev environment. We check in the repo, the repos into Git, and then just take it from there. So it should be to basically move running Bower install from the build server into just in the development environment.
Because you're using Bower in the dev environment, but then compiling it into something using some launcher Gulp tool into something that then check in, or you're not using that at all?
No, I think we just check in whatever all the repos, but using Django pipeline, we're just including the minified versions of the actual files that are coming. Right?
Okay, yeah, I'm even
Yeah.
concerned about that
Right.
question right now, because versus just putting a CDN site and making it served off from the websites now.
Right.
Whether or not you should be serving it locally versus
What I
online.
did on
Yes,
on main.js, they have a git ignore on all the live, some live directories. That means basically everything, that Bower brings in. It's ignored by Git. I've developed, and then I published out on Heroku. And once you publish that, once you push your product out to Heroku, it does a whole new build, and it runs Bower and runs all that stuff. And then it frees it all down. So I haven't had a problem.
That was actually something I was reading of when I was looking at node modules. What, like the whole question of do you check in node modules or not? And one area is if you use Heroku, you should be checking node modules. If you're not using it, you shouldn't.
No.
Yeah.
Go to a different platform, wrong kind of binary.
Like, they're saying for Heroku, they're saying you need to do that.
No, in Heroku, what you do is you give them this Bower.json file. You also give them your npm JSON file. What's it called?
Package.json.
Package.json. Yeah, it's one of those. But anyway, when you push it out on Heroku, it runs all that stuff. It runs the installer. It runs Bower. So, I mean, that's the experience I've had. So
The article was if you needed to do a fast load where you basically are scaling the servers up, you shouldn't be using that because it takes time for Heroku to build it up.
that is
And
true.
that NPM time takes time. So they're saying
Timing is an issue.
is that if you had a situation where you're using like an environment where you're launching stuff constantly and bringing it up and down, you need servers to be fast, then you need to check them all in because the server trying to bring the NPM loads would kill you in a performance issue. So I was trying to figure out the guides going, there's got to be a best practice here. It's like, yes, anything I choose, the internet says is wrong. I have no idea what the best practice is, and they all think.
I mean, with the system I've had, it takes, I don't know, I'll say 15 seconds to do the whole build, and it's there. That may hurt some people.
Right. No, so but what we noticed in that was, right, I mean, like I think in some of them the repo authors change the dependencies or something happens. So what may have worked on your dev machine, like yesterday, will not work when you deploy today, right? So then you have to go back in and resolve some of the dependencies in the bower.json, and then resubmit and retry. I think that's the only thing.
I typically do a build though just before I.
Well, yeah, okay. So if you do that, then you're fine.
Yeah.
I think what we used to do, I think in our like we go through all the testing usually on Thursday or Friday, and the deployment to prod is on Monday, and so the package is ready to go, more or less in the UAT environment. But because this issue didn't really happen for a prod deployment, but it was happening intermittently in some of our builds. So basically just as a way to alleviate that and just to make sure that we know what's going out when we do a production deployment.
If you're letting this thing pick which versions to play every time it runs, that's your problem right there.
Right.
And you shouldn't let it. I mean, letting it auto upgrade for your development stuff, that might be fine to test stuff out.
but for actual production development, you have to know the versions of libraries you're using. So that's completely inappropriate for anything other than playing around.
Right.
The other one that bites me occasionally is, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes the Bower bills that people put out there, and when you grab one that broke, and you're spending forever trying to figure out what went wrong, it turned out that somebody checked something in to a third-party site, like the Angular carousel broke at one point where it wasn't running correctly. It's like it took me a long time to figure out, wait, this isn't my code. And it changed the version. But I guess the second part of the question is when you do your dependencies though, you deploy referring back to the minimized version of Bower locally, or you convert it to a CDN version, serving off CDN site. Because almost all these components now are CDN served. So I'm kind of torn about whether or not to be served.
Right. So I don't think we actually consider that yet. What we are doing is just kind of using the minimized versions locally.
That's serving your files locally.
Yeah, serving the files locally. Right.
Because what we started doing was we looked at that, and we also looked at using CloudFront and other stuff distributed, which made a huge difference.
Right.
Because of the way these static files are getting cached.
Yeah, actually, something like government don't have access.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Some of my sites have to do it this way, other sites are kind of torn about it. But we're having problems with the sites that we have in government. We cannot allow NPM to be run because all the modules have to be part of the package. So they can't. We have a real issue with NPM because you have to have every single component localized because they don't have internet. And unfortunately, they require a lot of tools. And I haven't quite figured out how to get the thing where it gives you, the command where it'll copy everything to a directory for you. Get that to work because again, it's implementation dependent.
I think it's a question that's general, not just JavaScript. So Java, there's jars, there's gems. So it's the version external library, right?
Right.
And so from my perspective, you want to minimize the risk of software development. So you want to lock down the versions, have them local, internet. And you might be doing development locally. Talk about development versus production. So everything you have local, quicker, and typically, and you know what you have. So to me, it seems best to version any external library, and you don't use a CDN.
About version boundaries.
And that Bower config file there, if you take out the squiggly,
Yeah.
Yeah, you have.
you're basically locking down the library.
Right. Right.
That's squiggly name?
Yeah.
That's squiggly meant about.
Approximately
I'm not a JavaScript guy. I don't do any of this. I'm a Java guy. I'm here to be the sanity.
We'll speak slower.
Okay. All right. So yeah, we just briefly talk about Grunt was I think the first build task one that became popular. I think, but now I think Gulp seems to have more or less replaced it as the most popular build system.
I can't find an environment. I've been using Gulp because some faculty use Gulp, but I cannot figure out a way because some of the stuff still uses Grunt. So I've yet to see a Gulp implementation that doesn't require you to Grunt on
Oh, really?
at the same time. Does anyone actually?
Like there are Grunt plugins for some of the things that they're using, but no Gulp plugins yet.
Just because there's a couple things out there that still
Yeah.
Grunt. But I was just curious, has anyone actually seen like an entire environment where you just maybe run Gulp? Without Gulp, without Grunt package? Okay.
Again, in the last slide, I guess over here is about testing. I mean, again, don't really have much to say except that you have to kind of adapt while you're doing single page app development. There are many tools, new tools out there. Jasmine, I think, is one of them. I've used Jasmine and Protractor with Selenium, and Karma is a test runner. Again, BrowserStack is a service provider to basically allow you to test your stuff on many browsers, on the cloud.
BrowserStack, that's like a
BrowserStack is actually like it's something that allows you to it runs Selenium in the cloud to test different browsers as a
It'll let you
Yeah.
it'll let you select the machine,
machine.
and then you select an operating system on that machine equivalent. So you'll say, I want to test a Windows 10 device and I want to test IE6.
IE6,
And I
yeah.
want to do Chrome with this one. And they usually have the ability to do manual ones, so it actually brings up a virtual machine for you to work with. But you can also hook it up for automatic scripting using Selenium, using their toolkits. Sauce Labs, the other one, I kind of consider equivalent to it.
Sauce Labs, right. Yeah.
Their pricing models on both gets really bad depending on what you're doing with it. So in both cases, I found that it costs a lot more to automate tests than I ever expected because things just run slower than they should.
And the last slide, I guess, is just, I think since we talked about everything else, we should also talk about CSS. I mean, Sass is, I guess, now the best way to do CSS. At least it's kind of more or less taken over from less. It allows you to structure your CSS in a way that is modular. And you know, again, I mean, this will be used in conjunction with Gulp and other things. And I think that the last icon here is for something called Post CSS. It's just starting to become really popular. It's supposed to be faster or something, but I'm not. Again, I haven't used it. We use Sass for our project. I mean, like at least when we got the initial, we worked with like a design team that actually did the initial styles for using Sass, and we tried to keep that up. And initially, it used to be only available in a Ruby environment. I think the Sass was a Ruby gem, but now I think there's a Python implementation or there's a C implementation for it. So you don't need to run Ruby anymore to be able to run Sass, which was nice.
Well, that was one of those tests where you have to draw that without looking at your pen.
It could be.
That was amazing.
So yeah, that's all I have.
What have you done with in terms of front-end apps? What do you prefer?
What do I prefer?
Single-page app versus not?
I mean, I don't really have a preference. I mean, I think I'm just enjoying working with single-page apps after a long. I mean, most of my development, I think, as I said, I think I've done pretty much everything. I've done .NET, I've done Struts, I've done Spring Framework, which was a nice change after doing .NET for a while.
Spring MVC.
Yes, Spring MVC. And then I think recently, we've been working on Angular, which is nice. I don't think I have. Right now, it's like whatever is required to get the job done. I don't think I have a preference one way or the other. I think I would still, if I was doing something myself, I would, unless it really required a single-page app, I would still do a regular app, but whatever, Django app probably right now.
Server generating.
Yeah, server generating. I mean, yeah, and I think I keep reading things. I think the Ruby on Rails is doing some interesting things. I think DHH, I think the guy, who invented Ruby on Rails, I think he's a big proponent of servers generating the HTML on the server. So he's coming up with, there are things in Ruby on Rails called like turbo. I don't really know much about that, but it sounds interesting, like turbo links and things like that. Yeah. Which basically allows you to kind of, you get the feel, it's like a single page app, but still server doing most of the work in terms of rendering, doing the rendering and the template rendering and so on.
You mentioned anything about single page apps and SEO? Search engine optimization?
Yeah, prerender.com. The issue, a big issue in Angular, it's also a big issue in Angular is the way in which the SEO stuff works is it doesn't properly render information for cataloging purposes.
Right. Google search engine isn't good.
Right, and Bing and the other ones. There's what I wound up using in one project is something called Pre-render.io, which is a third-party service. And what it will do is it will go through and it effectively queries your stuff and then captures the results. So it will instrument the pages for you. It will call it out, and then you instruct if you're using like Nginx, for example, as front ends, you tell it when a request comes in, and it's a web service request. It's from Google or any other search engine. It will go out and it will return back the cache results from pre-render. So it will actually fill in that stuff for you. Otherwise, you wind up with 10%, $, model, whatever.
It puts all the keywords.
It replaces it for you. It does the rendering, and what it does, it generates the exposed template because the JavaScript doesn't actually run if Google calls it directly. If you go online, there are some stuff out there that tell you how to do it yourself. by basically modifying your stuff and caching it and telling you. But I actually found that pre-render IO for the 10 to 20 bucks a month was running me, just made it a lot easier. And I just put that in place, and then you just kind of instruct yourself. And the guy who runs, single guy, pretty good about working with you and kind of, if something isn't working right, figuring out what's going on. So I was really happy with working with that. It's the only thing I found that did the generation for me. The other thing you've got to be careful about is in putting in the tags for Facebook and other stuff like that. You've got to make sure to capture those as well, especially because you know those what do they call it? The OG colon stuff, what it's called when you put the notes in on Facebook, all of its meta keywords. Those also have to be properly cataloged for SEO purposes, and those have to be pre-processed as well. So it took us a little bit because I couldn't realize why my dev machines weren't fully cataloged and our prompts were, because the dev stuff, what we were running through pre-render.
And it's not gonna render anything.
Right, so it has problems doing it, but if you use the pre-render stuff, it runs it through and it converts it over and then it caches those results, as long as everything's catalogable. And then you combine that with basically creating your export of what the tree should be, because Google will use that information to know which pages should be captured or not. So you can combine those together. So that works pretty well.
Is that a, like a gulp task you can run or a run task? Is that how that works? Or is that?
Well, the caching itself is just done by changing Nginx. So whatever your front end is, you're telling it that when a request comes in, call this. And what will happen is when it calls this, is actually calling pre-render first. So you're redirecting it to them, and they'll go through and see if the page is cached. And the page isn't cached, what they do is make the request, then they cache the request, and then they serve that. So Google's getting a cached rendered page, as opposed to your raw HTML page, which has JavaScript on it. So there's some neat little keywords to kind of pick up on that. So that was a real issue we found with Angular that we had to get around because for some reason they thought SEO was important. Our numbers show it wasn't quite as important as they thought, but if it is important to you, you've got to do something about it.
Well, what if you have to have a secure session and you have to log in to get this software?
And you're not having Google searching your page anyway, right?
Yeah,
You don't want
then
Google
you're
to
there,
that information, and so it's kind of irrelevant. You just stop there. And you do your what's the name of the file that tells you what pages to search for?
robots.
Yeah, there's another one too that tells you what the site map. I'm sorry. Yeah, site map. You basically just build up your site map to exclude those things, and only put the public ones there. I'm curious to know what other people. We seem to hear at Full Street, we hear mostly in terms of single page apps about angular.js, and I don't know if that's true. Everyone else is that building mostly in Angular or still jQuery, and then also for anyone who's building an app, how do you decide between straight server-side generation of HTML or single page app?
So I'm at a new job now, currently custom built jQuery app, and one of my tasks is evaluate, modernizing, updating, and I evaluated basically all those items on the screen, Ember, Backbone, Angular, React, and Meteor. I was a little leery of starting a brand new project with Angular 1.0, 2.0 not really being available yet, so kind of crossed that one out. Ember had a really steep learning curve that crossed that one out. Meteor had a hard dependency on Mongo or their Mongo Lite thing. We have basically a backend Python that uses MySQL, and I didn't really need that Mongo thing. I crossed that out. And so I basically ended up with React, and I think I'm going to build some small components. We have basically everything we have is custom built. We don't have like a Bootstrap where you use its modal or any of that kind of stuff. Everything we have all this. They're all built practically. I think I'm going to take them one at a time, and they're all in this one big file. And I'm going to start modularizing those things out.
And the current app is a JavaScript, is a jQuery single page app, or is it?
Yeah, jQuery. It's basically 3 single page apps. So you bring up a page, and it kind of stays within that page, but there's like a menu at the top. What's one of the other ones it brings up. So it's like 4 JavaScript files, and each one of those is kind of like their little single page app. But they're just huge, and stuff intermingled in between them because the best way that they explain to me is it just grew really fast. It's a lot of spaghetti code and hard dependencies.
No test.
And not a single test. And so as I make these modules, I'm going to implement testing. I'm already running JS and things like that, and dumping out hundreds of errors and stuff. This week is my task is running JS and getting it to pass.
Right.
And then
There's a cool book called Working Legacy.
I'm sure. We have the user, backbone and MVC. We need that application. We are also thinking going to property. Would take up an HTML, using handle. In client side.
And why React?
Some of my team members is like they feel more comfortable in React and it's easy to compare.
They're not apples to apples, though, right? I mean, React is the
Yeah, so I don't know the exact details.
yeah.
So in my team was doing what
Yeah, it is functional programming, right? So more functional programming.
I used Require.js
Yeah.
when I first started out getting into JavaScript, and that kind of helped me make the transition from Java to JavaScript. YouTube examples, how to do classes and everything, using functional programming.
Right.
And but using that, I was able to bring in jQuery and create a whole single page app, and then I used Pre-requisite, create a whole 3D game, single page app. But because it was a game, it's just on your own. It wasn't talking to a server anyway. Yeah. It's a Require.js.
It's a loader. It's a
It's a dependency, yeah.
Dependency management.
And it's pretty much been brought into like Angular. You see it everywhere now in all the modules that need dependencies.
Right.
It uses the same type of things.
Been using kind of client-side frameworks, unfortunately, fighting with kind of migrating an application to React. That's the first one. Kind of single direction binding. Make it really fast. So that's something we're kind of moving toward. We're kind of deciding to take that in.
We're doing a lot of things here, but mostly you're either Ruby on Rails, you're a Rails server, or you're a Django server, and usually it's or a Java server for services, and you have a Angular front end. Put off by the 1 and 2. I think that 2 will be a big change, but I think 1 is very good.
yeah, I wasn't sure. First started hearing about the backwards compatibility phase, like they weren't interested. I'm sure they will be as it gets near, but like, well, I want to start a version 1 project and have to rewrite the thing in a year when 2 comes out. There's no easy way to back.
Be happy to go from Tapestry 3 to Tapestry 4, not a Tapestry 5. All completely right.
I think it's kind of unfortunate. Yeah, backwards.
They say now that you'll be able to run 1 and 2 side by side. Yes. Have your own ultra code and still run on 1, and then write new stuff into maybe migrate later, but
It doesn't. I mean, it doesn't
kind of
look, seem it's going to be as bad as Python 2 and 3 at least.
you have to go both.
different, view it as a different framework.
Yeah.
We also be happy, that's why.
We went ahead and we did our, something, we moved everything from jQuery to Angular. And I'm really happy with Angular, but it's probably the most painful moving for both, especially in some ways I actually didn't know jQuery as a negative, because you have to work, you have to accept that Angular is a very opinionated framework. It has a lot of thou shalls. React is very lightweight. It'll work with whatever you can plug it in and make it work with stuff. Angular, you have to be thinking Angular way to do everything.
Yeah.
Once you get around that viewpoint, it's very cool to understand that, but you have to accept 100% of their belief system. You can't just say, I want to use this part, like, oh, you can't say, oh, I just want to use services. You have to use everything.
Those guys must have around power fluid shit, these guys that wrote tapestry. You know, the tapestry way, it just doesn't work.
Tapestry, I remember that.
JavaScript, I mean, ES6, JavaScript is dependent Java. Be it anyway. OO and it's inheritance. It looks like Java.
But actually,
And
object oriented
TypeScript.
this time?
What's that?
Will actually be object oriented with real namespaces?
Yeah. And then it's
Maybe it might be useful.
TypeScript, types, and all right.
Except ES6 right now, ES6 versus TypeScript versus other stuff is getting a little confusing.
Yes, it is.
Because there's been too much push lately on TypeScript stuff, so it's like, okay, now we're gonna, which way the language is gonna evolve here. So the underlying ES6 I think is a given.
Yeah.
I just don't know what languages should be running on top of ES6 anymore.
I think with any UI framework, whether it's React or whatever you pick, next year it will be different. And you'll have to change it anyway. So,
The problem I have is my website is so big, we've had 4 developers who've been working on it for 3 years, and this is a complete rewrite, where we kept the entirety of the backend code.
Right.
We still have it.
I think that is a fundamental change in the way IT is viewed by the technology that, because I work with a number of organizations, they're used to the idea of, we've got applications that were written in the 90s. And like you write a development activity, it might take 5 years to build stuff, in large efforts. And the reality is with the frameworks, it's got about 2 years of life on a web framework before you have to be starting to think about the. I mean, Bootstrap 3 is still the whatever, but Bootstrap 4 is coming, and I'm gonna have to write all my stuff into Bootstrap 4, and I just got my stuff from 2 to 3.
Has anyone in the room built an app, the UI portion of the app, not the server side, that they are maintaining for the last 5 years, that they haven't been able to maintain and keep it upgraded and new frameworks?
Painfully.
Just I'm still replacing, it still uses 4.1 transition.
I've got code that I was working with today that I'm trying to, our wiring thing, because it works with the old HPXML request that IE6 uses, because we still have clients on IE6.
Right.
And so I'm having to make that coexist with Angular, because I'm trying to figure out how to get those two to kind of play as I move them over. But that's about 7 or 8 year old that it's been in production, without too much difficulty. The problem, of course, is when Chrome throws out an update and it changes the way it interprets 73C rules. That breaks off, but otherwise, yeah. So that stuff, the nice thing with that stuff is long as your library is stable, it's kind of there. But the newer stuff I've done is, it's changing faster.
I think there's 2 reasons for it. There's a lot of frameworks. I think one reason is that people are bad at reading other people. And so instead of really understanding something, just make your own framework instead. And say, I'm going to do it this way because that kind of works.
I think developers focus more on frameworks than on consistency and documenting your code. Simple.
Yeah.
Remember, it was hard to.
And the second thing I think is there's JavaScript doesn't feel like a whole language. It's starting to. So all these frameworks are really just trying to fill in all what we see with server objects. Just brilliant, right? Like wow, and promises, things like that. Like how did this stuff not exist before?
Promises were designed in space.
Yeah, I mean, but why doesn't it? So it's and it's still not really But I think there's, people keep using JavaScript. Slowly, people will not need to use. So I think, at least one way this could possibly end up is that people use a small little library, as opposed to classic. It's almost possible. I'm such a huge ecosystem of tiny little libraries. Pull in. You need to know when the DOM. There's a DOM ready. Yeah. Great.
Problem is, when you start doing stuff like that, like, we did an evaluation of all the frameworks. And what's kind of interesting is in some ways, one of the ones I like best came with commercial senses, EXPS. What was kind of really neat about that framework that was compelling is that you chose the framework, here's who you are. You don't have any choices to make.
Right.
The problem with doing anything that's jQuery based or Angular based is now you have all these decisions to make. Like, well, which plugin do I use now? And I'm going to have to keep evaluating that plugin choice because it's going to be wrong in 6 months. So how do you isolate yourself? But I hate that problem with languages too. I mean, for example, CoffeeScript's a great language. Don't use it, but it's a great language.
I use it. I don't like it.
Okay, it's a question of the pure stuff. SAS is a great language. SAS is a great way to do CSS. However, I talk to a lot of people who are hardcore people. I don't know. Less didn't survive. SAS man survived, but I know CSS will be here in 5 years.
I think the CoffeeScript and TypeScript, I think that's another symptom of JavaScript.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed.
Yeah.
And that's you get, I like I said, TypeScript's the interesting one to me because I like the guy who did it because he's Delphi, he's sharp, he actually understands language development techniques. Yeah. It's a little too tied into the .NET ecosystem, I think. But that's just a personal preference, whether or not I'm willing to move to Visual Studio or not. But the problem is that when you select a language like JavaScript, TypeScript, Dart, any of those type of things, even though it compiles in JavaScript, you're making a commitment. And that's the scary part about the decision process. It's like, well, yes, I'm increasing productivity, but I'm making a commitment to something.
Increasing productivity until you find the plugin and compile it.
You were asking about what type of languages and what type of libraries do we use it, where we used several years ago that we didn't change it, something would happen. But I mean, if you just downloaded, say, a jQuery version, 2013 minimized, and wrote a web page that used that, and you just kept that, it worked then, it wouldn't work now.
No. Unfortunately, not. It doesn't. Because they changed.
But I get it.
Let's rephrase
I
it.
haven't seen any
If
problem
you
with
kept your, not even if you told the user it's a big problem, if you take a flip argument, the big problem isn't that. The big problem is that every browser now automatically updates. And you can't control it anymore because you don't have an environment that's locked down. In most cases, even the government sites will work with lockdown now are allowing themselves to leave those things open. So the browsers changed and they break things that previously worked. If you could lock down the browsers, it wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I'm not having a problem because I have
Typically, the need of proper grade. If you lock down the browser, you get Async.
Well,
Yeah,
there's a
typically
trade-off.
is a security vulnerability. We can see from government. If they want to upgrade, so usually you have to have the cache or some update.
Yeah, for the
Like,
browser.
No, for the browser, also for the framework. Right, so you need to upgrade the open source.
So the government
framework.
is requiring you to upgrade jQuery?
Not jQuery per se, but some of the libraries,
Like,
potentially they have
but not jQuery.
So that's why actually I have the question for the group. All this framework, SPA framework, anyone look at the security implication of those?
We've had them run against. We've had it run with the way the sites I'm working with, again, the very next site is for compliance. They're running it through test tools. They basically are running it through the test tools to see what's happening. Our big issues have to do with the IS layers, for example, and the Nginx layers and what those permissions are set to. We have had some issues with having to do things with secure cookies and the way in which we're doing some other stuff. So there's a list of things that come out of our compliance reports. The frameworks themselves usually haven't been a big issue, but we've had to kind of tweak them a little bit to make them work certain ways. The browser hasn't really been the big problem. It's usually what we found is like server-side pieces that come in there. So they're really not concerned. The browser can do whatever it wants as long as you lock down your web service. Because there's very little in the browser space we hit there, as long as you upgrade to the newest compilers. We have had, like, some of our stuff is Splash-based, we have to keep those updated. We have had issues when, like I mentioned earlier, when browsers update themselves. But those are breaking things, not security. Most of the issues we get are because when we're doing the client server stuff, we have our server a certain way, and the data has to come back, and making sure that those things are written in that way we're doing authentication tokens and things like that are secured certainly. So those are the main things with that.
With single page apps, there's two things. One is anyone can see your code, but pretty much, even if you obfuscate or minimize, all your code is there, including inspector. So that's one aspect of security that's different than. And then the second thing is you can change anything in client-side code. So it's really just making sure your server is hardened to make sure that there's no holes there. But you can't trust anything from the client. Anyone could change that. But if you're doing it through just JSON RESTful APIs. Right, it's just cool.
But there's a possibility you can upskill like the code.
It adds.
It
adds things to get somebody who doesn't really care enough to support.
You try to compress in one of your application.
It has to be, but it's beyond compressed.
I just compress
The data.
What you were saying about obfuscating the code, you're saying something that was pertinent to SPA or
Well, if you have if you're a JavaScript client, all your code is visible to any user.
Yes.
As opposed to a server rendering HTML, where there you're just getting back HTML. The actual logic in there is not seen, should not be seen by the user. But you're not looking at that actual code.
But in JavaScript, there's a policy called same origin policy. Basically, you send the request right to the server download the JavaScript. So if that JavaScript can call other websites, it's okay, right? But if you download it from other places, can that be broken? Hey, one of those?
But you broken in many browsers with JSON.
So, I mean, from the framework.
That's a browser. They have to follow the rule of the browser.
So you open up Core or other stuff.
But then maybe the browser has, right? But the code potentially is vulnerability in the cross-site scripting vulnerability. That's possible. No.
It wouldn't be.
Framework lets you do that. You can tell the framework, okay, open this up for me, and then whatever you want.
I think the point which I think is a good one is that when I write single page applications that can turn back or if I'm writing a traditional application, I'm returning back HTML. There's no web services that get called that I have to expose. The problem is when I do single page applications, I've got to build the entire, which I think is a good thing, but I have to build an entire tier of web services. And there's an exposure there because you have to make sure that everything you're doing in your web services tier, you need those 100% there.
Basically, you have the rest, right? The rest, if you're not authenticated, server side is vulnerable. I don't know all this.
You use a passport library for handling all that kind of stuff.
Right.
In your section,
So
in your server, you would have a middleware that checks all that stuff out. They use that in the JS framework.
Yeah, that's right. So you can have a layer 7 data to set the all.
Yeah, some level of token, and there's no session, let's say, session, so you're validating that token on the server, whatever it is. There's various ways to do that, but that's your security.
But this is not including those. Yes, you have to have other like authentication, some other, like you said, passport,
Yeah.
JS file.
JS uses passport, it includes passport.
Right, because typically like, when you do the REST API call, you use OAuth. OAuth is the kind of authentication. Or you can use the OpenID, things like that.
Various ones. The problem is that all of them have, the pros and cons, but the bottom line is, it's up to you when you write your service-side component to protect the calls and to recognize there's nobody there. We actually have a couple cases where what we've done is we've divided the two sets of logic, which is, this is what we're gonna protect from the client. But we recognize that a smart developer can still get access to it. So there's certain fields that might be like, well, we'll just hide them on the client side and the UX and just not show them these fields. But we recognize that if someone really wants to do curl, they can still get access to that data. So there's a trade-off there. How much do you need to protect on the client versus server? And in some cases, it depends on what the network is and how secure it is. Like some of our stuff, we run everything with VPN, and we're assuming that the people in there are playing nicely according to certain rules. But other cases, if it's on an internet application, you can't play that. You have to lock down things, and you can't. You have to assume everyone's going to use kernel to look at your data.
Then that's the development versus production. You don't want to enable curl in the production.
Yeah, you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do about that if they have access.
It's just a request to the server, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I think it was in your security presentation, it said the biggest concern is internal anyway, right?
Right, yeah.
It's
So even, yeah, that's right. Even we put in the production, internal people can just VPN into it, use the curl, get all the data. That's also the vulnerability.
There's a lot, and then, again, varies on type of security you're doing. Dropin versus HIPAA versus something else, and I get really weird. But, going back to it, web services plus protection.
And that mode to give questions and see what comes over here.
I think we already did that, right? Think of a number. Yeah. Well, no, I think I can just give out marks.
Okay.
Everybody has been talking a lot.
Yeah.
So I think you just talk about
Yeah.
for sure. Co-presenter. You had the first. Keep the part. You can have right? Yeah, it's terrible. We have more mics last time. Right. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. It was a great talk. I learned a lot from everybody here. I hope it was fun.
We'll share the slide, we'll get some posts there, we'll post on the meetup.